Okay, today we are looking at Document C, which is the final perspective on whether people in the 1850s believed the Civil War was inevitable, that it was unavoidable, or if a solution could be found. So today we are going to be looking at a speech given by Abraham Lincoln. He is giving this speech to Republican voters while he's accepting his nomination to run for Senate. So he's speaking to people of his own political party about what he sees for the future of the United States. So to start, we're just going to go through, read the document, and add some annotations to help us understand it a little bit better. Okay? So it says, Mr. President and gentlemen of the convention, if we could first know where we are and where we are heading, we could then better judge what to do and how to do it. We are now far into the fifth year since a policy was initiated with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to the slavery argument. So he's referencing how just a few years previously, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, stating territories could vote to be slavery-free. So, the people believed that there wouldn't be any argument anymore, that it had already been settled by just voting. He said, under the operation of that policy, that debate has not ceased, but has constantly increased. In my opinion, it will not cease or stop until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. So, summary, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was meant to end the fighting over slavery, but it has continued, and Lincoln doesn't believe it's going to stop. This is one of his more famous quotes. He says, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I expressed this belief a year ago, and the developments since then have proved me right." Continuing his quote down here, he says, "I do not expect the Union to be dissolved," so he doesn't expect the United States to fall apart. "I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease or stop to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will halt or stop the further spread of it and put in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates are someone who fight for something, will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south." So major summary here. Lincoln believes the U.S. will have to choose to become slave or free, but it cannot stay split half and half. At this point, Lincoln is going to talk about some changes that he's seen in the country that is causing further division, and he's going to talk about changes that show he thinks it either needs to become all slave or all free. So he says, "Do you doubt it? Study the careful workings of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Dred Scott decision, and then see how little remains to be done." These are the two things he's going to focus on. He says, "The new year of 1854 found slavery excluded from more than half of the states by state constitutions, so state government, and from most of the national territory by congressional prohibition." So just a note, he's talking about how the compromises of 1820, the Missouri Compromise, and the Compromise of 1850 had really stopped the addition of slavery in at least half of the states, and then state governments, most of them were choosing not to be slave states either. He says 4 days later, things began to change. At this point, all national territory was open to slavery through the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So people, no matter where they lived now, could vote to have slavery anywhere in the Union, even in the North, where it was previously illegal. He said, and the first point was gained by slavery supporters. Supporters argued it was a sacred right of self-government, so their right to choose. But what they really meant was if any one man chooses to enslave another, no third man should be allowed to object. So they're saying, their right to own slaves kind of overshadows the right of other people to say no. Even if that person says no, the slave owner can still have their right to own slaves. Okay, now he's going to cover the Dred Scott case. He says, at the same time this was becoming law, the Dred Scott case was working its way through the courts. The second point was scored for the slavery supporters, was the election of a new president who begged the people to accept whatever decision the court made in this case. So what he details in the next 2 paragraphs is the outcome of the Dred Scott decision, which is that the Supreme Court case states that enslaved people were property, and therefore they could be taken anywhere in the U.S., even into the free states. It also adds that African Americans cannot be citizens. That point is made in order to deprive the African American in every possible event of the benefit of the provision of the U.S. Constitution that declares the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of the citizens in several states. So he's saying, this Dred Scott decision is protecting slavery by allowing enslaved people to be moved anywhere within the U.S., but it's also taking away the rights of African Americans, stating they cannot be protected as citizens, even if they are not enslaved. Okay, so to end, he says the decision, Dred Scott decision, coupled with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, was the third point gained by slavery supporters. The results are clear. No slave can be protected by the Constitution, preventing them from being entitled to all the privileges and immunities of the citizens in several states. Slavery cannot be excluded from any territories, so individual men may fill up the territories with slaves without danger of losing them as property, and thus to enhance the chances of permanency to the institution throughout the future. So what Lincoln has been saying in the second half of his speech is that slavery is starting to be everywhere in the U.S., either by slave owners being able to take their quote-unquote property to any place in the Union, or the ability that states now have to choose to be free or slave regardless of where they are in the U.S. So he's stating if the U.S. doesn't make the decision to stop the spread of slavery, it's just going to be everywhere, even if certain people don't want it. Okay, so as you are answering your questions for document C, your focus should be in the top half of this paragraph, or top half of the speech. Really, you can find your answers up until this point right here. Anything below this is just extra background. But to answer the questions, you can use this first half of the speech. Okay?